Moving on to a different topic now, we're going to now consider smart food systems and the challenges in the supply chain of food. So really pleased that Professor Louise Manning can join us. She works at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester, so just down the road from here in Malvern, has worked for many years in the sort of agri-food sector, so is very experienced and has contributed to books and obviously academic papers around this subject. So Louise, thank you ever so much for joining us, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the food supply chain.
Lovely, thank you. So good morning to everyone listening. I'm going to talk through smart food systems, but I'm going to focus on the challenge between greater transparency, and while that can be a benefit, but also the challenges that can then bring to the supply chain, especially around factors such as sustainability. So I'm going to cover what makes a food system smart, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a smart food system, and then to think more specifically around, does being smart as a food supply chain help governments, business and society to address some of the key challenges we now face? And being transparent and being able to share data will give many people who currently don't have an insight into how food is produced much more of an idea of how food is actually produced and its potential environmental, animal welfare or social impacts. And is that potentially a problem? So let's think about what makes food systems smarter. We hear in the media with academics talking around how there are a number of specific issues in the food supply chain and its footprint in the wider world. We need to consider that consumers and what they purchase has a real impact on the footprint of the food supply chain, but also how we operate on a day-to-day basis. And that can be anything from the product specifications we set and how tight they are in terms of visual quality for fresh produce, right through to the potential number of stages food could go through and how we could lose product in those processes. So smarter food systems are about us considering all of those ideas and challenges and thinking about how can we be more productive? How can we integrate our knowledge and also our processes to make our food systems more efficient, less wasteful, and ultimately more profitable? Now, sometimes profitability is almost seen as a bad word in food systems. But for many businesses, in order to be able to invest in social and environmental value, the core business enterprise that they have has to be profitable. And it's this balance of the economic value the business is providing, its sustainable value, and also its social value. This interconnection is what makes a food business resilient, but also makes food systems resilient and more sustainable. We hear the term smart living all the time. It can be applied to cities, businesses, our homes, the appliances we're using, the phones we carry with us, and we're increasingly seeing it also applied to smart food systems. And smart living is about having greater access to the information and resources that make our lives more productive, but increasingly, I use that word value on the last slide, feeling we have more valued lives and our impact of our choices, of our living, that we can have more information to know what that means in practice. We see the term smart right through the food supply chain. Anything from smart farming and how we can use technology and information systems to make our farming more productive and more efficient, smart contracts and how we interact electronically from business to business, the use of smart devices. If we just think about the use of smartphones and how we can order food that's delivered direct to our door. We can think of the advent of smart fridges that will tell us when our food is going out of date, if we have the right packaging on our food within that fridge. Cameras that we can turn on in fridges when we're in the supermarket so we can remember what kinds of food that we have, and wider smart homes. But increasingly, as we look at the UK's position in the world in terms of food policy and food regulation, we're seeing demands for frictionless borders, that information about food can be transmitted seamlessly, often not actually with the food, so that we can move food across the various borders and drive trade around the world. So this whole idea of a smart food supply chain is not just about how we bring food from farm to retail shelf. It is also about how we live our lives and how we connect with food. So this smart food system is about how we use technology and data to make our food safer and more consistent in quality, because it's that particular aspect, the consistent in quality, that can often lead to food waste along the supply chain. As I said earlier, along the supply chain, quality is defined in a series of specifications, from the wheat that we harvest from the fields or have been harvesting around Morven in the last few months, to how that wheat then goes into a mill, how it's converted into flour, and the specification for that flour in terms of the bakery, the finished bakery product, and how it then appears on retail shelf. Being able to be smarter in how we use data and technology potentially has a real positive impact on making our supply chains more efficient, less wasteful, and having less environmental impact as a result. And better access to information also allows business customers and consumers to know more about the food. That can provide greater informed choice and help us to meet the requirements of individuals that are asking more questions about the food that they're consuming. Now, some of those questions are key food safety questions. If I am an individual who has a particular allergy to a food ingredient or a food itself, I want to have more information so I can make informed choice about the foods that I purchase, whether that's in food service or on the retail shelf. If I have a particular environmental concern or sustainability concern, I want to know more information about that food and whether it is potentially linked to deforestation, modern slavery, or a whole range of other issues that sit around how we produce food across the world. So we're seeing the advent of a whole set of smart devices, both in field, in the manufacturing process, in the kitchen itself, or indeed located with the food itself, and the rise of smart packaging. And these sensors and indicators can give us an idea of how that food is performing in a certain environment. And as we said, this can give essential information to help those businesses working in the food supply chain to make more effective decision making. We're seeing the rise of data carriers, which initially were one-dimensional barcodes, but we're seeing the rise of QR codes. We're seeing the rise of radio frequency identification tags, so that information can pass with the food itself, or that those kinds of data carriers can be offloaded at certain points in the supply chain. The information on them can be offloaded and then pass with that food as it then may go into a whole variety of products. And one other area where we're beginning to see growth is wearables, not only in terms of animals and animal welfare. We're seeing increased use of wearables with staff, and ultimately we as consumers, whether it's a smartwatch, whether it's our phone we're carrying with us, a whole range of data is being collected about us and ultimately around our health. And these smart devices across the food chain are gathering a whole variety of data. For some individuals, they are fully aware of that data and where it is going. For others, they have less understanding. And that's where we start to think about transparency. And we start to think about where is the data going from either our own business or indeed from ourselves around the food supply chain and how it operates. So there's a series of advantages in the food supply chain in terms of smart systems. They help us to strengthen our supply chains and transfer information more easily. As we heard in the previous presentation, being smarter helps us to invest in the right area, knowing what the return will be, especially for food businesses that need to reflect on their ability to drive the net zero agenda of food production. It helps us to identify potential areas in the supply chain where we can develop new products, new processes to support the food supply chain, increasing employment and growth. And it allows society to engage much more in the food supply chains and how our food is produced. It also enables our society to determine whether they approve of or disagree with some of the systems and processes and the decisions that are made on their behalf. So we see some emerging challenges around smart food chains. There's the whole issue of security and the security of the data. There's growing issues of cybercrime, not only with consumers and purchasing details and thus credit card details being stolen, but also challenges of ransomware and malware across the wider food supply chain. And one issue that we consider, but I think will be considered more in the future, is the whole area of privacy and personal data around food and health. And these are emerging, privacy is an emerging ethical issue from the farmer right through to the consumer. So, does being smart help governments and businesses and society address the key challenges of the food supply chain? I think there are great benefits to us, food waste being one of them, making space for nature because we're more efficient in the areas where we're producing food. There are a whole range of ways in which we can develop smart systems to address the issues that we have right now in food supply chains. But in being transparent and sharing data, it gives far more insight into how our food is produced. Now, transparency is a great advantage. More people will know how our food is produced. Individual businesses should be able, if they develop their smart contracts, to find out about the pasta and where it was grown, to find out about what pesticides were potentially sprayed on the milling wheat, to identify how the fish lived their lives. The question is, does that then become a problem? Does that become a problem for the food industry because there is now more oversight of what is done? Is that an issue if we are dealing with quite complex issues that aren't binary? They're not good or bad, they're complex, and yet the data is then used in that quite binary way? Do consumers expect people to make some of these decisions for them? Is there a challenge of decision fatigue that could arise if we are given just too many choices about our food? Right now, these are questions that a lot of people are thinking about in the food supply chain and more widely in academia as we develop smart food systems. Because whilst there are great benefits, there are also some challenges we need to think about. And some of those flow very much into the ethics of food production and the ethics of data management. So what I've tried to do is give you an overview of smart food systems and to talk a little around the challenges and the need for greater transparency in supply chains. So what I want to do now is open it up to questions, so I can hear from the people that are on the webinar today and at the conference what you would like to talk about more.
Thank you, Louise. Very, really interesting. Yes. Do post some comments and also maybe your thoughts about, would you use what could be a more complicated supply chain system and use the data as part of the way that you choose what you eat? That would be really fascinating.
I'm going to interrupt. Sorry, didn't mean to. And I think there's a wider question as well. There are people who are going to be making decisions on what information consumers have and what information they don't have. How do we develop the trust structures that sit around that, the data trust structures, to make sure the governance of that data is appropriate?
Yeah, that's important. I mean, one of the questions I had is how you know that the initial bit of data that's being put in about the food, how can you trust that? An example might be line caught salmon, where it says it's line caught salmon, and maybe it is the majority of the time, but it's quite easy maybe to fool the system at the beginning, and that permeates through the supply chain. What sort of technologies and approaches make sure that that initial data is trustworthy?
Well, there's a whole range of systems that are being set up. So if we think of wild caught fish, for example, the use of GPS by the boats, having to identify where they are on a given day. So a retailer can go into the system and verify for this particular product that's on our shelf right now, the supplier has said that it was caught in a certain way on a certain day, and it's a specific batch. If we then look at the data and interrogate that data, can we then verify that that is correct? We have a challenge that having the data in itself doesn't mean that the people that are putting that data onto the system are trustworthy. But that's a challenge, whether they're writing it on paper or they're putting it into a computerized or an electronic system.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
And the other challenge is the more we differentiate our food, the more we say these are the ethical or sustainable ways of producing food, do we then create an opportunity for fraudsters to identify a way of making money by substituting? So in essence, the more we differentiate food with sustainability, we could be running into a problem of there being more likely to be misleading food.
Yeah, interesting. So Mark's asked a question. Even the current 5-point food labeling system can be difficult to interpret when you're in a hurry in the supermarket. And he struggled trying to find vegan products, for example. If we're trying to assimilate info on a range of other products, it's going to take 3 hours to go shopping, not just a quick an hour. So, is this going to be the new normal? Do you think people are going to be reading these labels and in more detail?
Well, I think actually there'll be an app and you will put into there all the things that are important to you, and you'll scan a QR code or something on the packaging or even online, and all of that is decided for you. So I think rather than us having to read a whole range of labels, what we'll be doing is putting filters into our phone apps or into our online shopping. And what we've seen during COVID is a huge rise in online shopping. So I think that the technology itself will be doing the filtering for us, that will say, this is what we want from our shopping basket. The challenge with vegan products specifically is there is currently no legal definition of vegan products in the European Union. So there is no legal definition, which then means that the vegan products that are being developed are being developed in terms of market standards, not legal standards. And also what we've seen is a huge rise in ready meals that are vegan, rather than the wider consideration of a range of food products that are more healthy and less processed, and also provide for people who wish to buy vegan food the assurance that certain facts have been taken into consideration. What's interesting as well with some of the research that's come out right now is that whereas 5 or 10 years ago people were buying vegan food with a key driver of animal welfare, that has been replaced over time with environmental impact. So whilst animal welfare was the primary driver of vegan foods historically, it's now shifted. And I think that presents a really interesting question as you go forward when you define the legal definition.
Interesting, good. We've got a question on Facebook from Steve. What he said is, can these smart systems benefit small scale producers and help them compete against the larger industrial producers or growers?
Yes, I can. Yes, they will. And I think one example is risk assessment of suppliers. At the moment, a lot of the information on which foods in which environments could potentially be harmful, on risk assessment of supply chains, a lot of that, there's the resource in the large companies, but for a small SME, it becomes really, really difficult. So I'll give you an example. In Canada, in the last few days, raspberries have arrived in Canada that have come from Chile and identified as Chilean, but actually are Chinese. Now, if you're a large organization with a very big technical team, or people that can look at food safety websites all day long, you'll be able to gather that information. Smart food systems and some of the systems that are being developed now are collating all of that information from across the world so that a small business could have a phone app and be able to have that information at their fingertips. So I think that there's a whole range of smart technologies that are being developed now that will support smaller businesses. If you look at some of the calculations that have to be done for carbon footprint and a whole range of other aspects of our food, to sit down as a small producer when you've got everything else you have to do in a day, it's nigh on impossible to be able to put that information on your menu. These smart systems will allow you to do that by putting, not only is it an opportunity for software developers and all those niche businesses that sit around it, but it be able to give real-time information to your consumers. So I can see an opportunity for a waiter that's asked a certain question about a product, that you could be able to give them that information relatively quickly through some of these smart systems.
So that's a bit like a wine sommelier or somebody that knows their wine at a restaurant actually will have to know a lot more detail about the food in general. It's that kind of extension.
I think in some restaurants that will be what people require. Will we see the McDonald's screen where you press for whichever burger you'd like? We see a whole range of information there now. What is the information that's going to be demanded in a year's time, 3 years' time? Or is there a distinct advantage for businesses in being able to give that information to their consumers?
Yeah. And one of the big problems with farmers and farms are they tend to be in rural locations where the infrastructure can be quite poor. And, for example, Worcestershire, Herefordshire, as you head out into the countryside, you don't necessarily have very good internet connectivity. What are the challenges with the infrastructure, both in the UK and overseas, in actually sort of linking all this supply chain from the beginning?
There are big issues with infrastructure and data storage. And I live in Herefordshire, and the internet is an interesting dynamic at many times of the day. But what I think is the bigger challenge is the integration between different systems. So a lot of systems have been set up historically that don't connect. So if you're a sheep farmer and you've got an EID tag on your sheep, that you are bringing them in to get identification, to link that with medication records, or to link that with the weigher on your farm. Historically, not all of that connected. What we're seeing is a greater connection now. So I think whilst infrastructure is a real issue, and we need to address that for all rural businesses, not just farmers. The big challenge for farmers as they try and develop their own smart systems on farm is the interconnectivity of all the different systems.
Any more questions on the chat? Anybody want to ask a question? And those of you that are listening on Zoom, you can just raise your hand digitally. There is an option. Okay, just the final one from me about the cybersecurity. I mean, we hear more and more about cybersecurity, affecting banks and so forth. So, is there a lot of specific research going into the sort of risks of cybersecurity for the food supply chain, or is it a bit more generic? Do you see pockets of real concern?
I think obviously the challenges around cyber hacking are people being very entrepreneurial and looking for potential vulnerabilities. So any business, reducing your vulnerabilities is the key. And there's a lot of activity now around engaging with farmers, especially the NFU Mutual, with saying, right, we'd like you to come to a health check. So you don't have your systems on the same computer as your children that are playing games, and a whole range of other things. So I think at one level, there's a whole degree of work and more needs to be done. But there is the potential, if we think of bioterrorism, to attack specific supply chains. And we have seen during COVID some increasing activity around ransomware because of the risks and the vulnerability. And if you're a large logistics company, then potentially you are more vulnerable to those kinds of attacks because they know they could potentially bring down an element of the food supply chain as criminals. So cybersecurity is a really big issue. I think there's a lot more that could be done around cybersecurity and food supply chains. And that also creates a great opportunity for businesses that are working in that area.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I mean, cybersecurity is a big industry in our area, in Malvern, Gloucester, as you know, with GCHQ down at Cheltenham as well. So hopefully some people will be watching and can pick up on that, which will be fantastic.
And I think the rise of Cyber Central in Cheltenham and the development of Cyber Central is a really exciting opportunity for the three counties. Yeah.
No, good. Well, thank you ever so much, Louise. That's really good. Hopefully we can add a few more questions and comments at the end with the panelists when we all reconvene. But thank you for that presentation. It was super.
Thank you.